The crossroads had a name before the bodies. Before him, the locals called it Miller's Junction. 2 dirt roads meeting between wheat fields and a stone mill that hadn't ground grain in 20 years. By the morning of August 14th, 1944, the soldiers had a different name for it. They called it Graveyard, and they were sending Private First Class Michael Brennan there alone. The order came at 0547 hours. Captain Whitmore stood in the ruined farmhouse that served as their command post, his face gray with exhaustion and something darker. The look of a man ordering another man to die. Intelligence had spotted a German probe moving toward their sector. Not the main force. Just reconnaissance. Maybe a platoon. Maybe 2. They needed time. Time for the engineers to finish the bridge demolition 3 miles back. Time for the artillery to reposition. Time for supply trucks stalled on narrow farm roads to clear the bottleneck that had paralyzed the entire advance since dawn. Time measured in hours that nobody had. Somebody had to hold Miller's Junction. Somebody had to delay them. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 1 man with good cover and a clear field of fire could slow an enemy advance for maybe 30 minutes before being overrun. 30 minutes might be enough. Maybe. Captain Whitmore didn't ask for volunteers. You don't ask men to volunteer for suicide missions at 0547 in the morning when they're running on 3 hours of sleep and coal rations. You pick someone. You look at the roster, and you calculate who has the best chance of lasting longest, who has the skills, who won't break when the full weight of a German company comes down on him like the fist of God. Whitmore's finger had moved down the list of names and stopped on Brennan, PFC, the quiet one from Iowa, the one who never complained, the one with a civilian rifle who'd been racking up impossible shots since Normandy, the one who'd grown up hunting alone in fields just like these, learning patience and precision in the cold mathematics of predator and prey. Brennan didn't argue when Whitmore gave him the order, didn't ask questions, didn't ask why it had to be him, why it had to be alone, why they were sending him to a crossroads everybody already called Graveyard. He just nodded, checked his rifle, and gathered his ammunition. The other men watched him go with the quiet relief of men who knew they were watching someone else die instead of them. They'd been calling him the farmer since he arrived at the replacement depot in July. Not because he worked a farm back in Iowa, though he had, but because of the rifle he carried. It wasn't a standard issue M1 Garand that every other rifleman in the European theater used. It was a Winchester Model 70, a civilian bolt-action hunting rifle he brought from home in a battered leather case that still smelled like gun oil and Iowa dirt. The rifle had a story. Brennan had bought it in 1939 with money saved from 3 summers working his father's farm outside Cedar Rapids. $270, more than his father made in 2 months. For a rifle chamber in .30-06 Springfield with a Lyman Alaskan scope and a hand-checkered walnut stock. His father had called him crazy. Said no rifle was worth that kind of money when a used Remington would drop a deer just as dead. But Brennan had held that Winchester in the gun shop and known, the way you know some things without explanation, that this rifle was different. He'd spent the next 5 years proving it, hunting whitetail in the November cold, picking off coyotes at 300 yards when they came after the spring lambs, learning every quirk and tendency of that rifle until it felt like an extension of his own body, learning where it shot in rain and wind and heat and cold, learning the trigger break, the recoil pattern, the exact point of impact at every range from 50 yards to 500. The armory sergeant at Fort Benning had tried to confiscate it 3 times during training. Regulations said infantry carried what they were issued. Personal weapons were unauthorized, unpredictable, a logistics nightmare when ammunition had to be standardized across an entire army. But Brennan had refused 3 times, quietly and politely and with absolute finality. The Winchester fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the M1 Garand. It used the same ammunition, drew from the same supply chain. The only difference was that his rifle had a 5-round internal magazine instead of an 8-round clip, and he had to work the bolt manually between shots. Slower rate of fire. But Brennan didn't need rate of fire. He needed accuracy. He needed the cold certainty of knowing exactly where his bullet would go every single time he squeezed the trigger. The argument had gone up the chain of command, installed somewhere at battalion level, where some officer with more important problems to solve had scrawled, "Approved, personal equipment," across the paperwork and forgotten about it. The rifle had stayed with Brennan, through the transport ships crossing the Atlantic, through the chaos of Normandy, through 6 weeks of fighting across hedgerows and farm fields, where that bolt-action rifle had quietly, methodically killed more Germans than most men kill with their semi-automatic Garens. He reached Miller's Junction at 0612 hours, as the August sun burned the morning fog off the fields. The crossroads sat in a shallow depression where the two roads intersected at right angles. To the north, the road ran straight for nearly 600 yards before disappearing over a low rise. To the east, it curved through an abandoned apple orchard where unpicked fruit rotted on the branches. South and west were the directions he couldn't worry about. Those led back to American lines, back to safety he wouldn't be seeing for a while. The stone mill sat 30 yards from the intersection, 3 stories of thick masonry with narrow windows and a partially collapsed roof. 18th century construction, walls 2 feet thick, built to last generations. It had survived 200 years of weather and war. Whether it would survive the next few hours was another question entirely. Brennan climbed to the second floor, his boots silent on stairs thick with dust and pigeon droppings. The interior was gutted. Empty grain bins, broken machinery, shafts of morning light cutting through holes in the roof. He set up his position in the northwest corner, where 2 windows gave overlapping fields of fire across the northern and eastern approaches. From here, he could see the entire northern road stretching away to the rise 600 yards distant, could see the eastern road as it curved through the orchard, could see the crossroads itself and the shallow ditches flanking both roads. It was perfect, too perfect, which meant it was obvious. Any competent German commander would mark this building as a threat the moment he saw it. But obvious didn't mean useless. It meant he had to use it right. He arranged his ammunition carefully on the dusty floorboards where he could reach it without looking. 68 rounds total. 17 stripper clips of 5 rounds each, plus 3 loose rounds at the bottom of his ammunition pouch. He laid them out in rows, organized by the order he'd need them. Closest rounds for the immediate threat. Backup ammunition further away. Every motion precise. Economical. The way his father had taught him to organize tools in the barn. Everything in its place. Everything where your hand could find it in the dark. Then he checked the rifle. Worked the bolt. Checked the scope settings. Adjusted the elevation. Knob a quarter turn for the longer range. Wiped dust from the objective lens with a piece of cloth torn from his undershirt. The Winchester was clean, oiled, ready. It had been ready since the day he'd bought it. He settled into position behind the rifle and waited. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the fog, turning the wheat fields gold. It was beautiful. The kind of morning that reminded him of Iowa in late summer, when the corn was high and the air smelled like cut grass and possibility. Strange how beauty didn't stop for war, didn't pause out of respect for the fact that men were about to die here. The world just kept being beautiful while people killed each other in it. He checked his watch. 0638 hours. 23 minutes since he'd left the command post. Somewhere behind him, engineers were setting demolition charges on a bridge. Artillery crews were repositioning their guns. Supply trucks were grinding their way down muddy roads. The whole vast machinery of the American Army was moving, buying time with movement, gambling that he could hold this intersection long enough for machinery to position itself correctly. He'd never felt smaller. The first German appeared at 0723 hours. A single motorcycle with a sidecar, moving slowly up the northern road. The driver and the soldier in the sidecar both wore the gray-green of Wehrmacht reconnaissance troops, dust-covered and alert. They stopped 200 yards out, and the soldier in the sidecar raised binoculars toward the mill. Brennan watched them through his rifle scope, the crosshair steady on the observer's chest. He didn't fire. One of the rules of hunting that translated directly to war: never shoot unless you know what's behind the target. What was behind these 2 scouts was the question that mattered. 2 men on a motorcycle meant a larger force behind them, a probe before the main body. Shooting them would announce his presence and tell the Germans this position was defended. Better to let them look. Let them mark the mill as potentially occupied but unconfirmed. Make them guess. The motorcycle scout lowered his binoculars and said something to the driver. Brennan couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language. Suspicious. Cautious. The way you act when you're looking at a building that might contain an enemy or might just be another abandoned ruin in a countryside full of them. The motorcycle turned around and disappeared back over the rise. Brennan exhaled slowly and lowered the rifle. They'd seen the mill. They'd marked it as a potential threat, which meant when they came back, they'd come prepared. Come heavy. Come with enough force to overwhelm whatever might be waiting in that old stone building. At 0741 hours, they came back. Not 2 men on a motorcycle. An entire company. Maybe 120 men spread across the road in a tactical column, moving with the careful discipline of troops who expected contact. Brennan felt his stomach drop. Intelligence had said a platoon. Maybe 2. They'd underestimated by half. This wasn't a probe. This was a company-strength advance. Probably the forward element of a larger battle group pushing toward the American lines to test for weak points before committing their armor and heavy weapons. He counted 3 officers by their positions in the formation, for NCOs directing the column's movement, and at least 2 machine gun teams carrying the distinctive profile of MG-42S. The Germans advanced in bounds, one group moving while another provided cover, then leapfrogging forward in the methodical rhythm of professional soldiers who'd survived years of fighting and learned to respect every suspicious building, every potential ambush point, every millimeter of cover. When they reached the 400-yard mark, Brennan made his decision. He couldn't stop them. The math was impossible. 120 men against 1. But he could make them pay for every yard. Could kill enough of them to make the advance costly. Could delay them long enough, maybe, for the engineers to finish their work and the artillery to get into position. Could turn this crossroads into exactly what the soldiers called it, a graveyard. He picked his target with care. The lead officer, a lieutenant by the insignia visible even at 400 yards, walking at the head of the column with the confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. The Winchester's crosshairs settled on his chest. Brennan controlled his breathing. In, out, slow. The way you breathe when you're waiting for a deer to step into the clear, when everything depends on absolute stillness and absolute certainty. He squeezed the trigger on the exhale, a smooth, steady pressure that broke clean and surprised him even though he'd fired this rifle 1,000 times. The first shot hit the German officer in the chest at 0744 hours. 417 yards by Brennan's estimate. The officer dropped without a sound, dead before his brain could process what had happened. Before his body hit the ground, Brennan had worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing in a smooth practice motion that took less than a second, chambered a fresh round, shifted his aim to the NCO who'd started running toward cover, shouting orders. The second shot dropped him at 400 yards, the bullet taking him in the back as he turned. The third shot hit a soldier carrying an MG-42 machine gun, killing the weapon before it could be deployed. Then the Germans reacted. 50 rifles and 2 machine guns opened fire on the mill in a storm of lead that hammered the stone walls like metal rain. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that drowned out thought, that made the air vibrate and the old building shake on its foundations. Bullets screamed to the windows and ricocheted off the interior walls in a high metallic whine that set his teeth on edge. Splinters exploded from the wooden beams. Stone dust filled the air. A bullet passed so close to his head, he felt the displacement of air against his cheek. Brennan pressed himself flat on the floor as bullets screamed overhead, his face against dusty floorboards that smelled like rot and pigeon droppings and the peculiar metallic scent of bullet impacts. He waited, counted to 10, 15, 20, forced himself to breathe slowly even though his heart was hammering and every instinct screamed at him to run, to move, to do anything except lie here while the building came apart around him. The fire slackened as the Germans realized they were shooting at an empty window. They'd laid down suppressing fire out of reflex and training, the standard response to contact. But now they needed to move to maneuver, to close the distance while their enemy was pinned down and couldn't return fire, which meant they'd start advancing again, which meant he had a window. Brennan rose back into position as the Germans began their advance. He could see them running in short bursts, using the slight fold in the terrain for cover, working their way closer in teams of 3 and 4. This was doctrine. This was what the German army had perfected in 6 years of war. The careful coordination of fire and movement that could overwhelm any defensive position through sheer professional competence. They were good. They knew what they were doing. But knowing what you're supposed to do doesn't help when there's a man 400 yards away who can hit a running target 9 times out of 10. His 4th shot hit a soldier at 340 yards, dropping him mid-stride. The 5th missed clean. Rushed the shot, pulled the trigger instead of squeezing. Amateur mistake. He cursed himself silently and worked the bolt. The 6th shot hit another machine gunner at 300 yards, the man carrying an MG-42 falling forward and pinning the weapon beneath his body. The Winchester's bolt moved in a steady rhythm now. Aim, fire, work the bolt, chamber a new round, aim. He didn't hurry. Hurrying led to misses, and he couldn't afford to waste ammunition. Each shot had to count. Each shot had to make them think twice about moving, had to make them afraid. By 08:02 hours, he'd fired 23 rounds, and the German advance had stalled. They'd gone aground in the shallow ditches along the road. Pinned down by a single rifle they couldn't locate precisely enough to suppress. He could hear officers shouting orders even at this distance, their voices carrying across the quiet fields in a strange acoustic clarity that sometimes happens in combat when all the rifles fall silent and the only sound is men yelling at other men to move, to advance, to do their jobs. The frustration in their voices was clear, audible. They had 100 rifles against 1. They had machine guns and grenades and overwhelming firepower. They had every tactical advantage except the one that mattered. They couldn't move forward without losing more men to that invisible rifleman in the mill. The Germans changed tactics. At 0809 hours, they began a coordinated assault from 2 directions. 30 men charged the mill from the north, while another group, maybe 25 soldiers, moved through the apple orchard to the east, trying to flank his position. This was the right move, the tactically correct response. Pin him from one direction, while another force maneuvers to hit him from the side. Brennan shifted between the 2 windows, firing as fast as he could work the bolt. North window, aim, fire, bolt. East window, aim, fire, bolt. North again. The Winchester grew hot in his hands, the barrel heating from repeated shots. Sweat ran into his eyes. Spent shell casings rolled across the floor with a metallic rattle. He hit a German at 210 yards who was leading the charge in the orchard, the man spinning and going down in a tangle of limbs. Shifted back to the north window and dropped another at 150 yards. The range was closing. They were getting too close. He could see individual faces now, could see the expressions of men running toward him with rifles raised. Young faces, old faces, afraid faces, determined faces. Just men, German or American or anything else. They were just men trying to stay alive in a world that wanted them dead. At 80 yards, the closest soldier went down with a round to the stomach. At 60 yards, another fell. At 40 yards, Brennan shot a sergeant carrying a stick grenade. An explosion when the sergeant hit the ground, and the grenade detonated took down 2 more men beside him in a blast that threw dirt and body parts across the road. The northern assault collapsed. Whatever momentum and courage had carried those men forward across 400 yards of open ground broke completely. They'd lost too many, advanced too far, without gaining the building. The survivors broke and ran back toward their original positions, abandoning their wounded in the open ground, abandoning any pretense of tactical cohesion in favor of the simple animal instinct to survive. Silence fell over crossroads, a heavy, shocked silence broken only by the moans of wounded men and the metallic tick of Brennan's rifle barrel cooling in the morning air. He'd killed or wounded at least 15 Germans in less than 3 minutes. The company had lost nearly a quarter of its strength attacking a single building defended by a single man, and they still hadn't taken it. Brennan slumped against the wall, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the rifle. His ears rang from the gunfire. His throat was dry as sand. He fumbled for his canteen with fingers that didn't want to obey, unscrewed the cap, and drank. The water was hot and tasted like metal and iodine tablets, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted in his life. He reloaded the Winchester's internal magazine with fresh rounds, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. 45 rounds left. 45 rounds against a force that could simply wait him out, surround the building, and kill him with grenades and machine gun fire at close range. But they didn't have time to wait. He could see that in the way they'd press the attack even after taking heavy casualties. Whatever orders had sent them down this road, those orders had a schedule, a timeline. They needed to reach their objective, whatever that objective was, by a certain hour, and he'd already delayed them by an hour and 7 minutes. The German commander made his decision at 0833 hours, and Brennan could read it in the sudden withdrawal of all visible troops. They pulled back beyond 500 yards, dragging their wounded with them, leaving the dead where they'd fallen, because retrieving bodies under fire was how you created more bodies. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The silence was worse than the gunfire. Waiting was worse than fighting. Brennan tried to drink more water, but his stomach rebelled, and he barely kept it down. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd killed, 20 men? 25? He'd lost count. They were just targets in his scope, just gray-green shapes that moved and then stopped moving. Except they weren't. They were men. Men with families and girlfriends and farms back in Germany. Men who'd been laughing over breakfast 3 hours ago. Men who were dead now, because he'd put bullets through them. He pushed the thought away. Pushed it down into whatever dark place you keep the thoughts that can paralyze you. He could feel guilty later. Right now, he had to survive. At 0847 hours, the mortars started falling. High-angle plunging fire that crashed through the mill's damaged roof and exploded inside the building with devastating effect. The first round hit the top floor and brought down part of the ceiling. The second hit outside, close enough to spray stone fragments through the window and pepper his face with debris. The third landed inside, 1 floor above him, and the blast wave punched the air from his lungs and left him gasping on the floor, ears ringing, vision blurred. The building shuddered. Old timbers groaned. 200 years of stonework cracking under explosions it was never designed to withstand. Brennan grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran for the stairs. The mill was becoming a death trap. They were going to bring it down on his head. He made it to the ground floor as another mortar round exploded on the second floor where he'd been positioned seconds before. The blast was enormous, a physical wave of pressure and heat and sound that lifted him off his feet and threw him against the far wall. The old wooden beams groaned. Dust and debris rained down in a continuous shower. He kicked open a side door and ran for the drainage ditch that paralleled the southern road. 60 yards across open ground while mortars walked toward him, each impact closer than the last. He made it halfway before the Germans spotted him. Rifle fire cracked across the field. A bullet hit the dirt 2 feet to his left, kicking up a spray of soil. Another snapped past his ear with the distinctive crack of a near miss. He dove into the ditch as a machine gun opened up, stitching a line of impacts across the ground where he'd been running a heartbeat before. The ditch was only 3 feet deep and choked with weeds and stagnant water, but it was cover, and cover meant life. He crawled south, moving fast, putting distance between himself and the mill. Behind him, another mortar round scored a direct hit on the building. The explosion was enormous. When he looked back, the entire northwest corner where he'd been firing from had collapsed into rubble and smoke. The Germans were moving again. He could hear the shouts, the sound of boots on the road. They thought he was dead, thought they'd killed him in the building collapse. They were advancing in the open now, no longer taking cover, moving fast to make up lost time. This was his chance, maybe his only chance. Brennan found a spot where a culvert ran under the road, creating a slight rise in the ditch bank. He set up the rifle on the slope, using the earth itself as a shooting rest, and checked his remaining ammunition. 19 rounds. 19 rounds to make them pay for their mistake. They came in a loose formation, spread across both roads now, their caution eroded by the belief that the threat was eliminated. At 200 yards, Brennan started firing again. The first German fell without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. The second spun and went down clutching his leg. Screaming, the third dropped his rifle and collapsed face first in the dirt. The fourth tried to run and made it 3 steps before the bullet found him. Panic rippled through the German formation like water. They scattered, diving for any cover they could find, firing wildly at a target they still couldn't identify. Brennan worked the bolt and kept shooting. He wasn't aiming at officers anymore, wasn't being selective, just shooting at center mass of anyone he could see through the scope, making them afraid, making them pay. 5 rounds. 6. 7. The bolt locked back empty. He reloaded with fingers that fumbled the stripper clip twice before getting it seated, cursing himself for the delay. Started firing again. The Germans were shooting back now, but they were firing at the mill, at the smoke and ruins, not at the ditch where he actually was. He took advantage of their confusion, kept firing, kept moving. 3 shots from one position, then crawl 20 yards through the muddy water and fire from another angle. Make them think there were multiple shooters. Make them think they were facing a whole squad instead of one man with a hunting rifle. At 0918 hours, he fired his last shot. The Winchester's bolt locked back on an empty magazine. He reached for another stripper clip, and his hand found nothing. He'd run out. 68 rounds across 3 hours and 34 minutes. 68 rounds that had held an entire company at bay. He lay in the ditch with the empty rifle and waited for the Germans to realize he'd stopped shooting. Waited for them to figure out he was out of ammunition and come finish what they'd started. This was it. This was how it ended. At 0921 hours, American artillery finally joined the fight. The first salvo fell long, exploding 200 yards behind the German position. Brennan could have cried with relief. The second salvo walked forward and landed directly on the crossroads. The explosions were massive, 105 millimeters howitzer rounds that turned the intersection into a hell of fire and shrapnel. The Germans broke. What was left of the company retreated north in a chaotic scramble, abandoning their dead, abandoning their wounded, abandoning any pretense of tactical discipline. They'd been sent to probe American defenses and push through light resistance. Instead, they'd spent 3 hours and 34 minutes fighting a single man with a bolt-action hunting rifle, and they'd lost. Brennan stayed in the ditch until 0943 hours, when a patrol from his own company reached the crossroads. Lieutenant Morrison led the patrol, a young officer who graduated from West Point 6 months ago and still looked surprised every time someone shot at him. He found Brennan sitting with his back against the ditch bank, the Winchester across his knees, methodically cleaning the barrel with a patch of cloth torn from his uniform. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then at the bodies scattered across 400 yards of road, then back at Brennan. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? The body count came in over the next 2 hours as the Americans secured the area. 33 confirmed German dead, at least 20 wounded that they'd managed to drag away during the retreat, all from a single bolt-action rifle in the hands of a private from Iowa who'd refused to give up his hunting gun. The engineers had finished demolishing the bridge at 0847 hours. The artillery had repositioned by 0915 hours. The supply trucks had cleared the bottleneck by 0930. The German probe had been delayed long enough that when their main force finally arrived 12 hours later, the Americans were ready, dug in. The Germans hit a wall instead of a gap, took heavy casualties, and pulled back to regroup. By the time they tried again 2 days later, the moment had passed. The opportunity was gone. All because of 3 hours and 34 minutes at Miller's Junction. Captain Whitmore came out to the crossroads at 1,400 hours, stood looking at the bodies and the ruined mill and Brennan sitting against the ditch bank. He brought a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, Real Kentucky bourbon, not the rot gut the supply sergeants usually scrounged. He handed it to Brennan without a word. Brennan took it, drank. The whiskey burned going down and settled in his stomach like fire. Whitmore sat down beside him in the dirt. They sat there in silence for maybe 10 minutes. Just 2 men drinking whiskey at 2 in the afternoon while bodies cooled in the August sun. Finally, Whitmore spoke. His voice was quiet. Horse, I didn't think you'd make it. Brennan didn't answer for a long time. Then, neither did I. Whitmore took another drink. 30 minutes. That's what I told them. 3 hours and 34 minutes, Brennan said. Not bragging, just stating a fact. Whitmore nodded. I'm sorry for sending you here alone. Somebody had to. They finished the bottle, sitting in the dirt. Then Whitmore helped Brennan to his feet, and they walked back to the command post together, leaving the crossroads to the dead. Private First Class Michael Brennan survived the war, survived Miller's Junction, and a dozen other engagements that should have killed him but didn't. He went home to Iowa in March 1946 and never talked about the crossroads, never told the story, never explained what it felt like to spend 3.5 hours holding a position that every tactical manual said was indefensible, what it felt like to kill 33 men, what it felt like to run out of ammunition and wait to die. He married Sarah Hoffman in June 1946 in the same church where they'd both been baptized as children, had 3 kids, worked a farm with his father until the old man died in 1968. Never talked about the war, not to Sarah, not to his kids, not to anyone. The Winchester Model 70 went back with him, carefully packed in his duffel. He hunted deer with it every November for another 40 years until his hands got too unsteady to shoot accurately. When he died in 1988, his son donated the rifle to a small military museum in Des Moines, along with his uniform and his medals, and a letter explaining what the rifle had done at Crossroads in France. It sits there now in a glass case with a small plaque that reads, Winchester Model 70, used at Miller's Junction, France, August 14, 1944. Most visitors walk past without looking twice. Just an old hunting rifle, civilian equipment in a military collection. Nothing special about it at all. But the plaque doesn't tell you about the 33 notches carved into the stock. Small marks barely visible unless you know to look for them. Doesn't tell you about the mathematics that failed. About the one man who held the line when holding the line should have been impossible. About what happens when you send someone to die and they decide to fight instead. About the cost of 3 hours and 34 minutes measured in empty shell casings and German bodies. And a private from Iowa who went to war with his dear rifle and came home with nightmares he never shared. Because sometimes the weapon doesn't matter as much as the man behind it. Sometimes a hunting rifle from Iowa and the stubborn refusal to break becomes more powerful than any military calculation. Sometimes one man, one rifle, one impossible stand writes the equation differently. And sometimes a place they call graveyard becomes a graveyard for the wrong side. Miller's Junction has a name again now. The locals call it what they always called it. The old mill has been rebuilt into apartments. The wheat fields grow wheat. Cars pass through the intersection without slowing. Nobody remembers what happened there. Nobody remembers the August morning when one man and 68 rounds held back a company. Nobody remembers Private Brennan. But the ground remembers. The earth where 33 men fell remembers. And somewhere in Iowa, in a quiet cemetery outside Cedar Rapids, there's a headstone that reads, Michael Brennan, 1921 to 1988, PFC, U.S. Army. It doesn't say hero, just his name and his rank and his years. Because that's all he wanted, to be remembered as a soldier who did his job, who held the line when they asked him to hold it, who came home when coming home seemed impossible, who lived the rest of his life as a farmer in Iowa, who once, for 3 hours and 34 minutes, became something else entirely. Subscribe for more untold stories from the war. Where are you watching from? Comment below.